Welcome everyone to day 2 of the Metadata Day event. The theme, as you know, is Governance as Code. And I am really happy that we had a great lightning talk session. I was up at 8:30 a.m. Listening to a bunch of great talks, and I highly recommend you go back and listen to them if you haven't already. But to give a quick recap, quick intro to who I am. I'm Shirshanka, co-founder and CEO of Acryl Data. Prior to this, I was at LinkedIn, where I founded the Data Hub project. If you're here and you don't know what the Data Hub project, quick intro. Data Hub is an open source metadata platform. Number one, huge amount of integrations, huge amount of adoption. We're pretty excited to see the community grow. And we're part of this Metadata Day community, creating this summit and conference. And it's been an amazing journey so far. Moving on, the community itself is growing. When I started Acryl Data, we had 200-ish people, mostly quiet. Right now, we have a pretty vibrant community of 3,000 plus Slack members. Maggie is doing a great job of reaching out to everyone and kind of making them feel welcome and giving them a way to contribute and make an impact on the project. We are worldwide and deployed in a lot of different companies and countries. We had people from Australia and Europe present earlier today. So it's great to see different industries and different geographies participating in this vibrant project. Moving on, Acryl Data, if you don't know, we offer a managed SaaS product built on top of the open source Data Hub, a few additional bells and whistles as you might expect, enterprise-grade reliability, intelligence and insights, and advanced capabilities for data discovery, governance, and observability. So that's us, but we're here for Metadata Day. And a quick history of Metadata Day, we all like lineage, right? So the inaugural session of Metadata Day happened in 2020, a lot of foundational questions, but more importantly, a rallying understanding of the importance of metadata in modern data practices, whether it is data discovery, data governance, or data observability, or even data management. Spent a lot of time there. A lot of thought leaders were there. Highly recommend you go back and check out those videos and those links. 2021, Zhamak published her now very highly cited blog post, and we spent time looking at investigating data mesh as an interesting idea that metadata kind of has enabled. And we investigated a lot of concepts at the intersection of metadata and how it enables the data mesh. Fast forward to today, we are talking about actually a key pillar of data mesh. And Zhamak called it out beautifully, federated computational governance. But let's boil it down into what it really means. Federated, so the act of removing centralization from the governance processes and kind of giving power to the data domains, federating out that act. And then the computational aspects of governance, meaning taking concepts that have usually been just in people's minds and policies and kind of bringing them down into actual code, into actual software systems. Therefore, governance as code. And so that's really the theme for our Metadata Day, and that's how we arrived here. Moving on, we specifically want to distill the high-level ideas of governance as code into ideas that are proven to work at small and large companies. So we have a huge group of practitioners who've actually taken and implemented modern data practices at a lot of companies here. We want to talk about practical implementation that you can put into production tomorrow. We have a hackathon that's ongoing, if you're not aware, where a lot of practical implementations of governance as code are actually being demonstrated. And finally, we want to build a community of practitioners because this is not just the end of governance as code as a panel. It's actually a beginning, and we want to create this community and move us forward to advance the state of the art here. I had a lot of fun organizing this panel with Josh, who is part of the LinkedIn data team. And the two of us actually wrote a blog post to kind of kick off Metadata Day. It was just published yesterday. So it talks about one specific technique of shifting left on governance by using schema annotations and how those have been applied to Data Hub. We'll, of course, talk about this and many more things in the rest of the panel. And with that, I would like to get into the real reason we are here today, which is talking to these amazing experts who have assembled. These are people who have spent decades in the industry, both in data and in privacy and in actually coming from research and academia and industry. So I'm really fortunate to welcome this amazing group of individuals. We'll go in the order of the headshots. Of course, I will not bother you by introducing myself again. So first up, Nishant.
Hi, my name is Nishant Bhajaria. I'm the Director of Privacy Engineering and Architecture at Uber. I report to the Chief Information Security Officer of the company. I'm alumnus of Google and Netflix. Before that, I'm happy to be on this panel.
Teresa.
Hey, this is Teresa Tung. I'm our CTO within our Cloud First group within Accenture. I'm helping a lot of our big clients, Fortune 500 typically, with their data transformations.
Joe.
Hi, I'm Joe Hellerstein. I'm obviously a professor because I just came from commencement ceremonies. So I've been professor at Berkeley since the mid-90s in data, but I have another role, which is in the entrepreneurial space. I have a black t-shirt out here somewhere. I founded a company about 10 years ago called Trifacta that was in the data preparation space, and we spent quite a lot of time with people in their messy data. And our products still exist as Google Data Prep and Alteryx Trifacta data prep as well.
Cool. Joe, we're just having a little tough time hearing you, so you might want to check on your audio a little bit. For people who didn't hear the latter part of that, Joe's a professor at UC Berkeley and founded a company called Trifacta, pretty well known as a data transformation company. Moving over to Juan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Juan Cicada. I'm the principal scientist at Data.World. We're the enterprise data catalog for the modern data stack. My background is on data integration using semantics and graphs and now knowledge graphs for like 15 years. Recently wrote a book on the topic. I started this at my PhD at University of Texas at Austin, spun out a company called Capsenta, which was acquired by Data.World a couple of years ago, and metadata and data catalogs. This is my life. So excited to be here.
Awesome. Amol.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amol Deshpande. I'm a professor at University of Maryland at College Park, where I've been working on various database and data management related problems for many years. This included a project called Data Hub, where we were looking at data governance issues, among others, in end-to-end machine learning lifecycle management. More recently, I also co-founded a company called Wirewheel, where we're building products to help companies comply with privacy regulations like GDPR, CCPA, and others. And of course, privacy compliance and metadata management or data governance are very closely intertwined together. So I'm really excited to be participating in this workshop.
And finally, Josh.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, getting over a cold. I'm Josh Shinevier. I am part of the metadata team at LinkedIn. I joined last October. Before that, I worked in data standards at Uber. I've got a background in graph databases, knowledge graphs, and data integration.
Awesome. One thing that people may not know is that Joe has actually written a paper called Ground that a lot of us have had the good fortune of sometimes collaborating on and sometimes getting impacted by in our daily practices. So a lot of great work that has been done by this team, both in research, academia, as well as in the practical field. So with that, a quick segue into how we workshop this. So a group of us, all of us, we got back into the workshop yesterday, and we spent time on a few burning questions when it comes to data governance and specifically governance as code. And so the way we're going to run the panel is walk through those questions and explore answers to those questions through the lens of the experiences and ideas of our panelists. With that, question number one is, what is data governance and why are we still talking about it? So I'll start with, at least where the tag cloud of conversations was. We started with this, next slide, Swaroop. We basically all agreed that data governance by itself is a really broad topic, and it includes a bunch of things: data quality, privacy, access management, lifecycle management. But really, what it drives, what the goal of all of this is to drive increased trust and to drive increased usage of data. And so this is a complicated problem. There are multiple kinds of personas involved, multiple kinds of concepts involved. And to have a kind of a lively chat about this, I would like to invite Juan, Teresa, and Nishant to kind of discuss some of the concepts that we went through yesterday. Who wants to kick it off?
I guess I'll kick it off.
All right.
I think for me, data governance is about making sure that the discipline about data, how to collect it, what to collect, where to keep it, who to use it for, those sorts of decisions can be made at scale using automation, so as to take away that individual decision from the engineer on a case-by-case basis because they simply don't have the time. How do you bake in governance identity into the data itself? If our customers, employees have identities, why not give data that identity and treat that like a first-class citizen? And the more you embed that into the data, the more you connect it to the attendant controls, and the more you automate that on an ongoing basis, the higher the possibility that you can keep data used correctly in a way that was originally intended to be without adding to the risk of the business. The reason we are still talking about it is because we have a decentralized tech infrastructure at most companies, disconnected engineers, CI/CD pipelines that are often bespoke. So the things that have made us successful so far have rewarded separation and discontinuity and process light. We now need to move towards a place that is still somewhat light on process, but has a level of discipline and deterministic decision-making to it. And for me, that's what data governance is about. The fact that we are talking about it to this point does not reflect a failure. In fact, it reflects a realization that the things that have kept us successful so far are insufficient for the future. So happy to discuss further.
I'll say something that's really exciting right now is that companies who were not traditional data companies like LinkedIn or Uber might have been are looking at data and AI more than ever, right? So in 50% of the earnings calls for Fortune 500, the CEOs are reporting on AI and their AI strategy, and so that means data is really part of that key business, which it might not have been before. And so that is important now because the governance is really what's needed to make your business decisions on that trusted data, like Nishant mentioned. And so right now, the time is better than ever to even get the funding needed to be able to roll out some of this federated computational governance.
So I want to add in, we have on the slide, Laura Madsen has this book. I actually have it here with me. I love it. It's called Disrupting, you can't see it here, but anyway, Disrupting Data Governance. I highly recommend this book. And she says the only reason why we do data governance is so people can actually use the data. And I think this is something, if you're going to go use the data, we really need to understand all the stakeholders involved. It's not just about the technical data producers, but it's also about who are the end consumers, the business users, understand their needs and what they want, right? And data governance is really about trust. And I think up to now, we've really been focusing on kind of protecting the data, which we definitely need to go do, right? But we've kind of lost or not realized that we really need to focus on usage. And I think when we start thinking about usage, we start thinking about other people within the organization and understand what they need and why they go need that. So something we say a lot is that data governance, think about it as like brakes in a car. Why do you have brakes in a car? Is it to slow you down, or is it to enable you to drive fast safely? I think up to now we've been thinking about it as it just slows you down, right? We need to be able to think about data governance as let me go drive fast safely. And I think that's the switch. And I'm, as Teresa said, I'm really excited that now we're seeing more of these conversations heading in the right direction.
Great. One of the things that we've also noticed is, often when you think about this problem of data governance and you realize that it's actually an end-to-end problem because it's not just about governance in your warehouse, you also have to expand it to have governance on your streaming ecosystem, and then you also have to expand it to include governance on your service APIs and all your third-party data. And so there's obviously a thought that maybe a horizontal approach to this and having a holistic approach to this is good. But Amol had some really interesting cautionary tales to tell us around this. And so I wanted to kind of have him talk a little bit about his experience in this regard.
Yeah, so as tech people, right, we like to look for elegant, beautiful, and comprehensive solutions. And for data governance, that solution often takes the form of a horizontal layer where you understand all the systems we have, understand all the data we have, and the moment we have it, the hope is that once we build it, then we can build things on top of it. But there's 2-3 things I have to keep in mind. One is that that building that horizontal layer is actually can be a multi-year effort in itself. It takes a lot of time to collect all the data. And many of the real reasons, the business use cases or other compliance use cases, they require that information today. And I cannot wait for 2 years to start complying with GDPR. I need to know where my data is stored today. I need to know where it is being transferred today. I need to know what it's being used for today. And so it's really important to focus, like make sure we have, I think tying back to the previous slide, that whatever we are doing is tied to those business values or business use cases to make sure we get the value, either in terms of actual value or compliance reasons. But while doing that, making sure that we are not doing the work twice, right? Like many times, the same things you need for privacy compliance are likely to be a big part of data governance. So let's try to make sure we're not doing the same thing twice, but that we are solving the immediate problems first.
Great, great. And that leads us to a very interesting framework that Joe brought up, which is, this might seem like a super daunting problem. Where do you even start? And this might be a good way to think about it.
Can you guys hear me? Is the audio okay?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. So, the theme for the day is governance is code. And I think it's this framework we should also put side by side with that idea and the question of whether and where that idea is relevant. But when I think about data governance, just to distill it down to the very basics, you have to start with policy, preferably policy as specification, right? And that can be code. And then you need observability of what's going on to get the transparency as to whether the policy is actually being met. And then you need, like any legislative system, it's governance, you need either incentives or enforcement or both, right? You need some way to get people to follow that policy. That's a much more human activity, much more human sort of engineering problem, right? It's a business engineering problem as much as it is a coding problem. So let's, as we talk today, thinking about metadata as code, keep open the idea that, well, some of this stuff actually won't be code. I think that's important.
That's great. And Nishant had some very interesting anecdotes around, using carrots as sticks or sticks as carrots, or maybe a little bit of both. So let's hear it.
And I'd be remiss, my publisher's going to hate me if I don't do this. I'm supposed to do this in every appearance I make. So I've written a book on this topic as well. Data privacy, a runbook for engineers. My elephant backdrop is obscuring it, so I'll send out a link on the chat channel. I'm actually donating all the proceeds to elephant conservation, so that's why my backdrop as well. So unfortunately hides the book in this case. But to your question, Abhijit, pretty relevant question. And when you work for the kinds of companies that I have, when you work for companies where it's an engineering first culture, you have to be very creative in terms of using the tools available to you. So I mentioned an example of a tool called Metatron at Netflix. That was a third party, that was a homegrown solution that we built for preventing access to data by third parties from the outside. So how do we make sure that the keys constantly get swapped? How do we make sure that the algorithm constantly gets changed? So what I did was I took that tool from the security organization and said, I'll repurpose it for privacy. What that meant is when folks said that we needed access to the data, so Netflix is a freedom and responsibility, engineers can access everything kind of culture. So we couldn't just bring down a top-down process where everybody had to go to central IT for permission. So what we said is, fine, you say you need the data, we will give you the encryption keys, give you the algorithm access, and then we will check and see, do you access the data at least once every 7 days? If you don't access the data once every 7 days, we will swap the keys, or we will make some changes so as to make you come to us and ask for information again. And if you choose not to do that, that means your requirement was not really valid, and we will change the keys all over again and make sure that you get locked out of the data. What that means is, rather than taking something away from engineers preemptively, we take it away from them after giving them evidence that they don't need the data. This is an example of tooling, process, and governance all at once. And I totally agree. It's not going to be fixed with code. You need to understand governance in the context of how the organization collects and uses data, and then find every way possible to repurpose tools that already exist. Because for one thing, it's going to be hard to get engineers on board to a whole new tool for governance. So if you can repurpose existing tools as a combination, it is an economically sound argument. It's also going to be programmatically much easier.
Great. So I
want to just very quickly chime in here as I love this example that Nishant says. Another example I have from one of our customers I work with at Prologis, they actually, everybody's bonus is tied to data quality. Like 25% of everybody's bonus to the company. I think that's another carrot. That's an example of incentives that come from the executive level. I think that's the type of stuff I'm seeing kind of conversations in the chat. We need executive buy-in, and that comes from the example from the CEO.
Great. So we've got at least a framework for what data governance is, what are the activities that go on as part of data governance, what are the challenges. The fact that there are multiple personas involved is definitely a huge part of the challenge. And we're already seeing a lot of conversation about how to bring the business user in, how to bring the technical user in. These cohorts have kind of been separated, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. And so we addressed kind of the next question head on, which is like, how can technical and business users actually govern data coherently? Is there even hope? And so the first kind of solve there that we discussed was, this concept of a layered metadata graph. And I'd like Josh to kick it off for us here.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the reasons we like to think of metadata as a graph is that it's very multidimensional. You have a lot of different concerns that need to be modeled. You have a lot of different dimensions of the domain that need to be modeled. You have, dimensions that deal with just representing what the data is. You need to represent things having to do with compliance. You need lineage. And graphs tend to be good at sort of bringing together different views of the same things. The things being, data sets and users, and so on. So I found it very helpful at two organizations now. To think of the metadata catalog as a graph and to model it that way. I don't know if you want to add to that, Juan.
Yeah, so something that we've realized and kind of seeing a lot of the discussion going in the chat is we need to think about governance from two aspects, right? There's like two, I would put them into two cohorts, right? You have the data producers, the technical folks, and then you have the data consumers more on the business side. So you want to be able to think about it. What are the needs that each one of them have? At the end of the day, the data goes through and you need to make sure that you're using the data. Right. So the question is, who needs the data? What is it for? Let's go start cataloging those use cases, those needs, those business glossary terms, right? Like, let's call that the business or the logical layer right there. And all of that needs to get connected too, right? So you have the business terms, the people, the organizations, the use cases. Let's start connecting all that stuff. And then from the technical side, everything is, I'm gathering metadata, tables and columns or dashboards, so lineage, all these things. I do sensitive data discovery. I put all this stuff together. And then we've always had kind of this gap. And what we need to go do is start just making connections between the technical and the business side. So I think that's why graphs naturally lead to be able to connect all this stuff together. But I think what's important is to be able to go think about it as two lenses. For the consumers and the producers. And even when you think about tooling, you think, is this tool more for the producers? Is this tool more for the consumers? And what is a tool in the process that's going to put these two things together? And in addition to that, I think we'll talk later, but there's a whole aspect of decentralization, centralization, treating it as a product, but we'll talk about that in a bit.
Related to that, while we have traditionally always thought about business users as consumers, there's actually an emerging thought of kind of including them a bit more than in the past in actually the data production process. And Teresa had some really good ideas there.
I mean, that's one of the tenets of the data mesh is that the business takes a bigger ownership of data products. And if anything, I want my business, right? I want our HR team, our finance team to say, this is the data you should be using for making your decisions. I want to see the same thing, and I want to see the same thing that people who actually know about HR and finance have approved. So I would say the business is not just a consumer, they're better suited than anybody to actually describe the value of the data and to make the definitions in the data. And so something very pragmatic that could be done there is that, maybe the business user, so an example that we've worked in is with, let's say, with anti-money laundering or finance. There's certain reports, there's certain suspicious activity and transactions. Those might be somewhere that the business will spend a lot of time making the definitions, defining even the quality as it relates to those topics. And from that, we can combine this with technical metadata, right? We can actually track back the lineage into other tables, other transformations, places that maybe that expert didn't have time to label, right? But we can actually still see, because we can see that's how the data is being derived and being handled. We can go upstream and downstream to really propagate some of those domain semantics that have been added, right? So these are places that, again, in this case, the data product is really being something that the business should really own and have a big stake, right, in actually publishing.
And related to this concept of a data product, is the consequence of when the product is unhealthy, who gets involved. And so one of the things we talked about is whether, taking the software engineering approaches of like someone's always on call for a service, right? So when a service goes down, you actually know who's on call and you call them and then they go fix the service. So if we applied that same concept to data, we realize that it's actually not as simple, because a data set or a data product not being healthy could have multiple reasons. There could be like a technical reason for it not to be healthy because maybe the pipeline ran unsuccessfully and just failed to produce the data set, or maybe the pipeline actually produced data but just doesn't meet the quality semantics that you expect from the data. And then going further up, there might be business failures that are happening that you need to also capture. And obviously, rallying around this concept of who's on call for data, but then bringing in all the different personas into that responsiveness and the responsibility might be one way we can bring both cohorts into the mix, into this kind of joint stewardship of the data product. So that's kind of one thing that we kind of finished with as our closing thought on this particular section. And I'm looking at kind of the questions coming through. I think we'll move along, and kind of the next question that we went into was really moving from this understanding of, all right, we need some form of separation of personas, but we need a consistent metadata graph. We need to bring in business users earlier on in the definitional part of the data product. We need to have incentive structures aligned. And we started getting deeper into the workflow of a data producer and started asking the question, well, what does this look like in practice? What are the tools and contexts that a data producer needs so that they can fulfill their duty towards data governance? I think Josh has obviously lots of thoughts here around schemas and shifting left.
Yeah, lots of things to say. I'll try to boil it down a little bit. Also, go and check out the blog post that Shirshanka mentioned. That goes into some of these details. But what the blog post focuses on is what we called shifting left, or in other words, moving the source of the metadata as close as possible to the source of the data. We talk a little bit about the distinction between a schema at a physical level and a schema plus semantics, which is really needed. There's a little side chat here about GDPR for compliance, for protecting user privacy. We need to know what the data means, not just what its structure is. So that the best place to add that information is as close as possible to the place where the data is produced. When you're writing a schema, add annotations, and there's a lot to be said here about separating the semantics of the annotations from the policies that they activate. The standardized vocabularies are important, mappings are important, best practices are important. So that's a few of the things. And ownership should be mentioned as well. That's a big thing at LinkedIn right now, is establishing accountable ownership for all of our data assets.
So we thought maybe we should just copy paste all practices from software engineering and things will work. But Joe had some thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, so I don't know if Josh got to fully wave the flag for that idea, and it's a good idea. So I want to take a moment to be positive, which is there are a lot of practices in software engineering where we've learned to have iterative processes that can make things reliable in the face of great deals of complexity. And the software engineering business is probably the most complex artifacts that people have created, and those processes are very helpful. So ideas like continuous integration and testing that work well in software engineering. Indeed, we should import some of those ideas in the data space, and there's been tooling to do that and practices, and I'm a fan of all of that. At the same time, and this gets to the point on the slide, data governance lives somewhere in the world between what you can think of as like software engineering and what you might think of as security engineering, in the sense that we want the data to be taken care of in ways that involve human processes. And when you talk to security engineers, they'll tell you right away that the biggest source of security leaks is the wet squishy things, the people, right? That's your weakest link in your security, and we have the same problem in a lot of ways in data governance, that we have to think about the human side. So we have to think about, why would a person do a bad job of data governance? Why would we not trust them? And how can we incent them to be trusted? And it's not the same as with software engineering. It's really much more like security in that sense. So I don't think it's a direct copy paste. I don't think that just doing CI/CD for data is going to solve all our problems. I think we need to think about kind of the human side very much differently.
Awesome. And actually related to this, we talked about also what kind of tools can data producers be given so that they have to worry less about these things. And Nishant had some great ideas and experiences from his time.
Yeah, so shift left doesn't work unless you prepare right. So my general approach is, when you go as far left as possible to identify the data, identify ownership, you want to make sure that that is going to give the producer some value. Because at the end of the day, the engineers have been made commitments. Remember, they get paid, compensated, promoted based on throughput. How many lines of code? Maybe that's a bad one, but how many tools do they get out the door? What does the engagement look like? If that doesn't work, your engineers will leave your company, and then you'll be left to secure nothing at all. So you want to make sure that when you identify service owners, data ownership, asset ownership, you want to correlate that to actual tooling. So if you register your service with me, we will take care of your deletion. We will take care of your extraction, your preservation, your encryption, anonymization, dissemination. All of that will be taken care of at the back end. Of course, the logistics will matter in terms of the details. That is, when does that happen? Does the engineering team actually check the work before it happens? But fundamentally, there has to be an immediate value to the engineers, saying that you will have more time to do the stuff that you are supposed to do, and we will take stuff off your plate. I was in a meeting earlier this morning where one of my colleagues said, is this a real job, or are we just hiring another program manager? So certain disciplines have become identified as being inefficient and not value add. And if governance becomes that, it's going to be bad for all of us, for our customers, for our engineers, for our stockholders, everything. So you have to make sure that any identification of data and service maps to actual tooling. And there's actual tooling that needs to happen with the data, right? And the engineers will see that they can all they're accountable for is identifying the data correctly, understanding its risk. And then as long as they do that, for the most part, we can give them a lot of tooling at the back end. So that's kind of my approach.
Great, great anecdotes there. Another thing we talked about quite a bit is, do we centralize all the tooling, or do we decentralize all the tooling? And I think Juan, had a lot of interesting ideas there around when to centralize and when not to centralize, and whether this is all against the data mesh concept or actually aligned with the data mesh concept. And so, Juan, why don't you tell us a little bit about your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, I think it's the next slide, right? There we go. So, and I want to go address directly, Pam is having questions here. And I'm saying, look, there are existing kind of data governance teams and tools and all that stuff. There is a balance between centralization and decentralization. Today, most of the stuff that we see in organizations, that you have a central IT team. That central IT team, the central data governance team, they are disconnected a lot from the business. They don't understand the business context, right? They understand the technical context, but then why are they expected to be able to go label and do things without being in the business understanding that? So that is kind of the discrepancy we have. Now, it doesn't mean that we need to go push everything decentralized and then put the data governance teams on the side and that's it. It's really to try to find this balance. So the question is, what do we go centralize and what do we push and decentralize? Again, it's a famous answer. It depends, right? It depends on your industry, what regulated you are, right? If you're very finance, there's a lot of things that need to be regulated and they need to be in a centralized way. Depends on the size of your company, right? If you're a smaller company, 100, 200 people, you can't afford being decentralized. But if you're a larger one, you can. You may start growing from a centralized to decentralized. It also depends on the culture within you have your organization, right? That's another aspect to go do this. So examples that we see is, look, we need to define some policies, some security policies, GDPR, like that needs to be defined from a central perspective. What are we going to define as PII? Not all sensitive data is PII. What is our company's definition of what is PII? We're going to go centralize this. And then you're going to pass these policies out to the decentralized nodes and say, you go off and you go implement them. We're defining what they are, and we're going to give you the tools so you can automate as much as you can, but you are responsible for the implementation of these things. So there may be some other policies that you want to be able to go do in a decentralized way. I want to go do some special type of tagging for the data sets that I own. All right, you define your policies for your data sets that you want to go do. Other organizations that we see is like, hey, we want to define what a phone number is, because we don't want anybody else to redefine what a phone number is. And those have implications from customer service, from GDPR. A phone number has a country code, an area code, an extension. It has a mobile phone number, a work phone number. Mobile phone numbers have to have SMS permissioning. It has these types and all that stuff. And we want to be able to go centralize what that definition is. And then decentralized nodes can say, hey, I'm going to use that to go check my data quality. Am I doing that correctly or not? I'm going to go use that so I can generate automatically new schemas. So when I'm going to go define a new system, I don't have to think about what a phone number is. It's already been given to me. So I think this is the balance that we really understand, kind of what fits in centrally, what fits in decentralized, depends a lot. Industry, your culture, the size of your company, and many things. And yes, it is hybrid.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things we came back to repeatedly is, the definition of what does good look like is always centralized, because you can't really decentralize. Are we doing good at data? No, because that is actually something that the whole company believes in a certain way. So maybe your belief is that you must have more than 3 owners for every single tier 0 data set, or your belief might be that your pipelines must be landing data on time every day if they're powering a critical dashboard. There's so many different ways in which you define what good looks like, and that is always going to remain a centralized problem. In fact, what we see most people rally around is saying, give the centralized data governance team more powers to actually define good and reduce the grunt work that they have to do in going in and doing clean room curation and tagging and all of that stuff, and allow that to get automated away as much as possible. So those are really the themes that we are exploring. How do we give almost superpowers to the data governance team so that they can accelerate some of these central movements that they want to do to their data ecosystem? So moving along, one of the things that we also talked about is, so what can we do in practice, right? And one thing we can think about is, what are the interception points? Like you've got data is constantly changing. So what are interesting interception points for us to actually inject these governance, either monitoring capabilities or actually enforcement capabilities, right? You defined good. Now, are you going to watch if good is happening, or are you going to actually make good happen? And both are valid approaches. And so we need to find interception points. What are these? Well, we already talked about one of them when you're defining your schemas. And interestingly, these schemas don't necessarily have to be your data warehouse schemas or your tables. This could also be upstream, your streaming ecosystem. They could also be your service API definitions. Those are great points to actually interject. You could have a schema linter that's actually integrated with your build system. So these are all places that almost at check-in time, you're able to stop bad things from happening. But then you also have runtime interception points, like when pipelines are running, when they're transforming data, they can actually check whether the quality of a data set meets their expectations before actually running. And these are starting to emerge. A lot of new systems are starting to produce these kind of hooks, these kind of capabilities, where you can have circuit breaking capabilities inside your pipelines. You can also not just stop bad things from happening, but just alert on policy violations. And these can be implemented as kind of a monitoring solution on top of the exhaust that is coming out of all of these individual systems. So in a nutshell, determine what good looks like centrally, and then push implementation of good as far upstream as possible, because the more you can prevent bad data from progressing in your data ecosystem, the less cleanup you have to do. So we've talked a lot about automation. We've said there's some good things about automation and bad things about it. But what role does automation really play in enabling a bunch of these capabilities? The first discussion we had around this was abstracting things away from engineers and making them enabled. So I think Josh and Nishant had some great ideas here.
You want to start, Nishant? I'll jump in.
You can jump in first, Josh. I'll take it from you.
Okay, sure. So along the lines of what I was saying before, kind of cleanly defining semantics of data, cleanly separating policies from the semantics of data, giving engineers, allowing engineers to annotate their data with policy relevant information without being experts in the policy is something that I've found to be pretty important and something that we're focusing on again at LinkedIn. So say back to the blog post, we have an example of a person type where a person has a name, has an email address, maybe has some other things like a profile picture. We don't want engineers to have to be familiar enough with our data policies that they can say, okay, this field needs to be protected in this way, this other field needs to be protected in this way, in this context. We want them just to be able to say, this field represents an email address, this field represents the user's profile picture. And from there, we have associations between semantic terms and policies. But we want to make things as simple as possible for the engineer, where they can just click through a drop down to get to the appropriate type to annotate their schemas with. I'm going to jump in from there, Nishant.
Thank you, Josh. And that was great. What I would say is what Josh is describing, sort of the brass tacks, like you at least need this for the program to succeed. What I would say is I would open the door to engineers saying that, fine, we don't need you to understand necessarily how categorization happens. But I tell them, usually privacy and security are the forcing function as to why categorization actually happens. Basically, that unless you make people realize that there is danger to not doing this, it typically doesn't get done unless it's existentially important for the business. What I would tell people is, as your relationship with engineering improves, as your tools become used even more and more, you want to tell people, hey, so far this speaks just to privacy and security. And I tell my engineers, I'm like, I don't want you to delete more data than you have to, because I don't want Lyft and DoorDash to have an advantage over us, right? So we will do the initial categorization based on privacy security needs, but then you should come in and take a look at the data. Just as an example, if I have Josh at gmail.com, that's Josh, the customer. I want his data to be supremely protected, but Josh at uber.com might be Josh, an engineer who's doing some testing. I don't want, sorry, that's my dog. I don't want that data to be deleted prematurely. So now I may not be able to distinguish from a privacy security perspective which is which. So I would want Josh to look at the data and say, you want to keep this email categorized from a privacy perspective, but this other email you do not want to categorize in this fashion. So invite your engineers so that if they need to understand more, if they want to partner with you, they will do it happily and willingly because they've already seen how it works well from a privacy perspective, and then bring them in the door so that they can have an equal say in how the categorization actually happens. So there is a balance between overburdening engineers with too much process and not letting them have a voice at all. Find that place in the middle. And I think the comment about how things get defined differently over time applies here as well. The role of the engineer also changes definition as your relationship changes.
Yeah, and on the subject of roles, maybe we should say a little bit about expertise. Again, we want to make things easy for the engineers, but you do need experts in policy. Like you need a legal team, you need someone who's thinking deeply about relating data policies to regulations like GDPR, to the company's privacy policy, and so on. You also need ontologists or people who are have deep expertise in schema design, but you don't want to require, again, engineers to have this deep expertise themselves. So it's important to separate concerns.
I think the one thing I really liked from that discussion was that the engineers just need to know enough in terms of the vocabulary and what that means, but they don't necessarily have to know the next level from there. And I think that's a good way to kind of give them enough information so that they're specifying the right amount, but not overburdening them with too much context. Juan and I geeked out about this for quite a bit, so I think this deserves a slide. We kind of have this notion of metadata as driving tests. So we've talked a lot about this definitional notion of defined good, and we're basically riffing on the metadata graph itself as being that system against which you can define a policy as a test. And remember, these policies obviously can be higher level, or they could actually be lower level. You get the full spectrum of the business graph as well as the technical graph against which you can write these tests. And then we could actually evaluate these tests continuously, almost as metrics. So instead of your business KPIs that you're evaluating, these are almost like your data ecosystem KPIs. And then in the cases where these tests are so important that you really want them to never fail, you almost translate them into constraints or policies that are enforced at the right interception points. And one of the concrete examples we talked about, and Josh also had some ideas here around, like, we can rally around the concept of these tier 0 data sets and say, okay, tier 0 data sets have to maintain some goodness. And how do you define goodness? Well, it must have a certain amount of ownership. It must meet certain freshness criteria. It must have a certain amount of vetted compliance metadata. And then you take that test and you integrate it with your CI/CD systems and your orchestration systems. And that can lead to some really good outcomes. You're no longer kind of reacting to bad things happening later on, but you're able to kind of take your definition of what a good tier 0 data set looks like and then pushing it down into the infrastructure. Juan, would like to also get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so this goes to the heart of what we mean by having governance as code, right? If we want to go automate things, we really need things to be inside computation. We put it as code. And I think in this aspect, we want it to be defined in a declarative manner, right? So these schemas, these constraints, these contracts, these policies, these need to be formally defined in a way that we can go compute on them. And there's existing standards out there, right? I know Josh and I go back to a long time to W3C stuff and standards and the semantic web. Like there's DCAT for data catalog vocabularies, Bravo, Dublin Core, SCOS for vocabularies, and then there's the whole RDF, OWL, Shackle Stack, and all these things. Like these are already languages that exist to be able to go represent things formally. Now, what we want to go do is to represent these policies as code and then operationalize on that, right? Use them. So think about this. Your metadata you're graphing, that is a graph that is connecting things together, right? That is just basically, I'm observing the real world as it is. Then you start defining these policies also as code, and these policies basically become queries over that graph. So as a quick example, like the PII stuff, right? So we know what sensitive data could be, so much stuff. We're going to define that PII means number, ID number, email, IP address, whatever you want to go define that. That needs to be written down somewhere as code. And then there may be another policy that says, if you identify something that's PII, you need to slap on whatever that is, a restricted policy. And that can have whatever implications to go do. Now you run your sensitive data over your sensitive data scanning tools over all the data you have, and you identify PII. You should be able to go say, well, this is PII. I know that I should slap that as restricted policy, and I know the lineage of that. And this thing goes all the way to all these dashboards. All those things imply that they should have restricted policy. I should also inform the stewards and the owners of all these pipelines, of all these dashboards, of all those tables that this just identified. That should be all, that's the automation that we're gonna go do. All this is possible because one, we've represented that governance policies as code, and then we can query that metadata all together, and it's all connected in a graph. So at the end, just think about it. Represent the metadata as a graph. The policies are part of the graph. You query that all together, and then you start propagating changes, sending notifications. I think, Shirshanka, you and I are very aligned on this, and we're really excited
and so hold on to this thought, because we'll get deeper into kind of what it looks like in kind of a multi-tool, multi-platform. All right. So moving on, there is always a cautionary tale, and we've seen a lot of chatter about looks like this is the automation people, there's a lot of worries here. And I think Amol has a lot of real world experience with how hard automation is. So I'd love to hear.
Are we getting
That's
zoomed on here or
automation.
what?
That is automation. Sometimes you hear music.
Right. So I mean, I think automation is where we want to get to, right? We want all of these things to happen automatically, and we're able to look for, let's say, sensitive data or take the appropriate action, or like trying to do this even at the level of processes, right? If you want to say that the same process for doing transformations on the data, if someone else in a company is doing it, you ideally would not want to replicate that, right? If a machine learning model has already been built, I should be able to find it and reuse it somewhere else. This is obviously the goal that we all strive towards. I did research on this. I think a lot of people are researching on this. But it also is a really hard problem to solve, especially in a big enterprise. Right? There's a lot of teams involved, a lot of data, a lot of processes that are involved. And so what I see, and my experience has mostly been from the privacy side, what I see is that companies have trouble even answering simplest questions today. It's like, what data sets do I have? Where are they stored, right? They literally start from that point because there is not even a simple asset inventory for them to get started with. So in many of these cases, so I think of automation in two different places. There is obviously the real automation where we want to go inside, do all the discovery and things at that level. But there's also just process automation. Right? Today, we need some processes in place. These might be in privacy world, the privacy impact assessments or high risk assessments. Right, a very pressing task for many companies, and there is a lot of back and forth involved. There are questionnaires, surveys. Many people need to be involved, and these processes can be automated today, or not fully automated, but you can reduce the friction in them a lot. Right, and simple example, for instance, is product teams or developers like to work in a tool like Jira, right, or some equivalent tool like that. Oftentimes, you can set up the back and forth between the governance tool and a tool like Jira fairly easily. Right? We have a lot of APIs all over the place, integration platforms to help you with that. So for instance, you can make it so that the product teams and the dev engineers, they live in Jira, but the privacy team lives in their own tool, right? And you do the back and forth between them. And that helps reduce the friction a lot. So now, instead of a complicated process trying to figure out, oh, when did we start collecting social security number? Who approved it? What all needs to be changed in order to fix it, because we really should not be collecting SSNs. Instead of doing that at the very end, we can do it at the very beginning. Right? The moment someone says that I have to add a new feature, immediately they have to confirm that, hey, I've gotten this approved, I have these reasons for doing it, and that all can be done in Jira today. Right? It's not that difficult. We have set it up for some of our customers. We can do that in Jira. The privacy team is notified, and you have reduced the overall friction. Right? I think we sometimes focus on the lower level automation a lot more, but I think the process automation can really help these teams work together with a lot less friction. Right?
And as long as you also have a little bit of additional monitoring on top of the process automation, then I think you've got a pretty good solve. One specific thing I had noticed at a previous employer was, we had a very good intake process where we would sit down and kind of validate that the data that the engineering team is saying they're collecting is actually indeed what they're going to collect. They would fill out a nice little form saying this is what we're doing. We would kind of give them the stamp of approval, and then the feature would get built out. But then when modifications to the feature happen later on, no one's kind of paying attention. And so there's that little bit of the, you did all the good work at the gate, but then this continuous evaluation thing becomes a challenge. And then it leads sometimes to like the need for periodic backfills, I guess, or periodic reprocessing of, are you sure you're still doing what you said you would do a year ago? So that's the only challenge with that approach, but it definitely is a good first step. All right, so we've gone all the way from, defining data governance, talking about the different personas, talking about certain techniques, a way of thinking about the problem. And a lot of it has been somewhat limited to the metadata universe. Like we've talked about catalogs, and we've talked about catalogs as kind of this unifying thing. But the catalogs are not the only thing. It's the modern data stack despite all our attempts to simplify it, continues to be, I mean, probably during this call, another tool got built to move some data from something to something, or to transform some data in some interesting way, and probably also got funded in the meantime, right? And so this modern stack is going to continue to stay ever evolving, ever innovating. So how do we ever get a handle around it? Like, what is the role of these different tools, these different platforms in actually enabling good data governance? So that was kind of our last thing that we were kind of wrapping the conversation with. And one of the things, at least I have noticed, prior to this, I was at LinkedIn, where everything was kind of very bespoke. I mean, we were big users of open source. And like, as I've stepped out and kind of seen what companies are now doing, what this modern data stack starts looking like, I'm noticing that the modern data warehouses are already lifting the abstraction from, yes, I can do joins super fast, to actually, I'm also giving you capabilities like tag-based retention, access management. You talk to Snowflake, BigQuery, like all the big ones, like they're starting to move up that cognition hierarchy. And that means that these platforms are starting to participate as enablers of this policy application that we're talking about. You define good, you monitor it, but then you're now able to start applying policies into these systems. And so there's an emergent possibility of standardization of capabilities for data management that we think is pretty cool. Platforms are kind of supporting not just, here's a SQL interface, go have fun, but actually capabilities on top of it that are more oriented around data management that can collaborate nicely with a policy enforcement engine. So moving along that concept, Joe had an interesting, provocative question, and I'll let him ask it. So his question was, I'll just say it for him, that, ignore the fact that these are different tools built by different vendors, and they're, trying to,
Thank you.
Okay.
I've been taken out of my box. Yeah, so I think it's easy to get lost in the soup of, we have 17 different things in our organization, and we're getting an 18th one tomorrow, and it's a mess. And just start by imagining that you own the whole stack for a minute. And there are people who do own the whole stack. Snowflake owns the stack. Amazon certainly owns the whole stack. It's a gigantic one, probably too diverse. Google Cloud might be a smaller edition of a public cloud with many offerings. If you own the whole stack, what would be your ideal? So how would people specify policy? How would people monitor things across the pieces of the stack? And then how would you incentivize people to use the stack wisely through metrics and so on? And this is not, it's not impossible. And as a starting point, it gets us thinking about what's hard. Because there's so many things that are hard that we can't control. We might start by asking, what are the hard things we can control? And to me, one of the hard things that comes up right away from my experience working with products in these closed ecosystems is identity and access management. So particularly, the idea that at different layers of the stack, you want different notions of roles and identities really makes it hard to do cross-cutting data governance. And a simple example would be, I want to track every access into storage like S3. So suppose that our base storage layer was a ledger. It recorded all writes and kept all versions, and it recorded all reads. Totally reasonable thing to propose. But then what happens is, 3 layers up, there's a BI tool, and the BI tool's user identity is BI admin, because they're doing role-based access control. And that gets transmitted all the way down into S3, and now there's no accountability again. So I think, the semantics and the ontologies of who is whom and what is what with identity and access control, to me, is like a core question. There's lots of circumstantial questions too that we can talk about, but I think getting at these core questions is really, really helpful, because it helps us keep our heads sort of focused on what can we fix and what do we just sort of have to deal with, because that's the way the world is.
Cool. And hopefully the muting problems have been resolved. So Amol also had some very interesting ideas around some things that are actually absent in some of these APIs that are evolving.
So, I mean, I have all kinds of thoughts, and many of these I think are great research questions. Some that I'm working on right now on how you know, fix or how do you improve data management systems to make some of these things easier. For instance, and I'll list out a few of them. One, I think the relational model for many of these data warehouses can be a little too low level for many users, right? I think data warehouses could work towards bringing that abstraction one layer up. Right? We've been very happy with relational model for 52 years at this point. But at some point, I think the number of elements you have to deal with, the complex connections between them just starts becoming too much. Right? And I think that hinders good governance, because someone who is looking at a database without significant help cannot tell what's going on in that database and how to get the data out of it that you might need for various purposes. Other things like, for instance, databases, once you have access to a database, you can do whatever you want with it within that access limitations. There is no easy way to keep track of why you are using it, right? A simple thing that many databases could potentially support is if you are asking a query that involves a lot of data, you might be asked why, right? Why are you running this query against a production database, especially if it's something new, right? I think adding some of this functionality, one of the other projects that we're working on is how do you separate sensitive data from non-sensitive data automatically in a database system, right? If you're able to do that transparently, that could really help in many different situations. It can reduce the impact of breaches and generally speaking, make more privacy-related issues simpler to manage. So I think there's a ton of things that data warehouses could do, but most important of those for me is to raise the abstraction, allow more semantics to be added to the data that is being stored inside them.
One interesting detour we took around this idea of adding more to the abstraction is the introduction of quality metrics into the API itself. So when you're accessing data, you have a sense of what's the quality of your data as part of that access API itself. And Joe brought up an interesting point. Well, views are supposed to solve this, right? And I guess logically, but we haven't seen a lot of practical usage of views to encapsulate data quality in a way that it just works, right? So people have probably done bespoke implementations in their worlds, but I haven't seen a practical implementation that everyone has snapped to. So there's an opportunity there, I think.
Yeah, I think you and Amol are very much on the same page with that. And so the question is, what are the abstractions and how do you get people to standardize on them that sit on top of this relational implementation, whether it's views or what have you?
Cool. And then we started talking about also the citizenry that tools need to exhibit beyond just moving up the cognition stack and supporting a bunch of these additional capabilities than what they have before. And the first thing that Juan had a very passionate plea on is just this: emit as much metadata as possible. And I think Teresa just said something similar on the market as well. So perfect timing to go for it, Juan.
Yeah, I mean, so we have all these tools, right, that exist, and the tool that somebody created in the last 30 minutes, right, Shirshanka, and got funding too, right? What we want right now is tools will continue to come and go. What would be great, as Teresa was saying, is that let's demand that they expose as much metadata, whatever metadata is out there. And then we will have our metadata layer, our data catalog, whatever you want to go call that. It is the job of that metadata layer to catalog those points, catalog those dots, that stuff that comes from those systems, one. And then actually start connecting the dots from all those systems, right? Oh, this thing is here, this relates is here, it's moved, you get the lineage and all that stuff, right? So, and then part of the dots that you're collecting stuff is the policies, right? The schemas, the constraints, the contracts, like this is also should be part of that code. And then all of this gets connected. And that's why I'm so passionate that because it needs to get connected, it's a graph. And then as Joe was saying, very wise words. I love this about how automation is not just about let's just do things. It's really about incentivizing, right? So when you're doing this monitoring or this enforcement, it's also kind of like, hey, you got those metrics, right? What is the quality of, what is the completeness of things right now? here's the state of the art today. How about we go do something to improve that? And let's go see how that goes, right? And these are things, and again, whatever you define as complete or quality, whatever, these things need to be part of that metadata layer. And it needs to be queried over all those different metadata points that we're cataloging from different systems. And I'll throw it back to you, Shirshanka, because you had the other great point of saying it's not just about us consuming, but pushing it out. So I'll throw it back to you.
Right. And so, definitely we need to demand metadata exhaust, but then we need to flip it around and say, well, we don't want people to always be coming in and finding all these amazing insights inside only the catalog. We would like to actually take all these insights, important upstream metadata, and actually move it into the tool so that when the business user is operating on something in their specific tool, like looking at a Looker dashboard or something like that, they're able to actually see that the health of the data set that this dashboard is built on is actually not good, because that's not information Looker has. And so we need to, again, demand that these systems that have so far been built more as I'm a BI tool and I'm going to connect to other things and then allow for curation on top, but actually allow for metadata to flow in from external systems to actually enhance the experience that people have within the system. We've actually seen, so open source does give us some advantage, and I've seen some of these practices play out in some of the community. There are companies that have taken, for example, Redash and Data Hub, and then added capabilities within Redash to just pull in additional metadata from the Data Hub layer. But I think even for commercial vendors, it'll be very cool if they started opening up some of those APIs so that we are able to propagate metadata across multiple systems into the tools where people are. And really, this is what kind of we all believe in, that this ability for a central control plane that can really translate these policies that originate in a human brain, but then finally get transformed into some sort of automated code and then get pushed down into platform-specific primitives. And that would be pretty cool.
And I want to bring up something I know Josh was commenting, and I think when it comes to the exhaust, it's like, yes, you can go create the metadata lake or whatever, but I mean, I would argue that metadata is not as complicated as just any other data system that any schema that anybody created, right? If you look at any relational database, I mean, JDBC is out there and already has some already standards about these things, right? Tables, columns, all that, the data types, all that stuff. We already have, there are existing standards already for metadata, right? The W3C has DCAT, the data catalog vocabulary. There's provenance to be able to track lineage. Dublin Core, the library scientists have been doing this for how many decades? They've been doing this, like all this stuff already exists. And I think it's a call on the data tools out there to say, go, if you're going to go emit your metadata, please use these existing standards that are out there. And it's really not that complicated. Josh, I know you and me are kind of passionate on the standards and the semantic stuff. I don't know if anything you want to go add, putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, and that was something like I said in the pre-chat that impressed me about data.world, that you were really using these existing standards. And to kind of echo something from the chat, I think the reason that it makes sense to use standards in the metadata space is that there are more commonalities for the metadata than there are for the actual data, which is highly domain specific. But like you say, we have a lot of common concepts around what's a table, what's a column, what are lineage relationships, and so on. So there are a lot of opportunities there.
And I would argue that's why we are not just optimistic, Joe, but that's actually a reality. I mean, if we think about it, a data catalog is a metadata integration system, and any data catalog out there is already integrating. I mean, Data Hub, how many systems do you collect data from? Like, that's equivalent of how many sources of data do you integrate, right? If you think about it from a data integration perspective, as well, I got to go integrate 2 or 3 databases. That's $1 million in 2 years of work. But now we're very quickly being able to go integrate metadata comes from all these systems. I mean, I can tell you at data.world, we can add a collector in, if it's not a days, it's hours. And so it's because it's not that complicated when it comes to the metadata concept. So Joe, I am very optimistic, and I'm seeing a lot of progress, and that's why there's a big boom of data catalogs.
The only cautionary tale I would say that I've noticed there is I used to think that dashboards were a thing and that everyone knew what a dashboard was. And then I got involved in integrating with Power BI and Tableau and Redash and a few of these other BI tools. And I realized that in some of these tools, these are reports, and in some of these tools, these are worksheets, and in some of these tools, there are charts that are inside these, and in some of these, there are tiles, and sometimes the tiles are reusable and sometimes they're not. So it's actually, so we can all agree about tables because funnily enough, tables are actually pretty standardized. But even there are details. If you integrate with Salesforce, it actually gives you a field level last modified time on the schema. You'll never get it from any other kind of database. So there's all these idiosyncrasies that show up in how people have implemented what we can walk and talk about and say is a human concept. But when you actually boil it down into that final integration, you find so much nuance in how an individual application has modeled something that it gets quite complicated. That said, I'm a big proponent of standards, but it's just been hard, especially as the further away you go from the core concept of a table, the more complicated and fuzzy it gets. And Joe is nodding vigorously, so I think he'll tell us something about wrangling scripts.
I'm not going to do that, actually. I just want to amplify something that Teresa said. I think I liked her attitude towards this, which is that it's an iterative process and you've got to get started somewhere. And I think that does unify some of the optimism and the pessimism here. There are things you can get started on. Tables are easy. It gets harder the minute you even pop above that's like, what's a data set? Every product I've been involved with had a different semantics for what's a data set. And then when you start talking about things like what's a person and what's a product, and we all know that's super hard. But you can get started somewhere. Identity is a required thing in most platforms that we work with. So starting with identity is really good, really good. And I guess Teresa, your point, maybe you want to expand on this because you've probably been through this with clients. Is you get started and then things get better over time, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's how you get the value. I think there are a lot of questions about that, right? So clearly do what you need to be private and secure and compliant, but then you can, start with, again, the reports that are really important, the critical finance and HR data that is very well understood, right? Like in some ways the data is actually easy. It's probably relational and well structured, but everybody in the business likely needs it to power the business. So if you start with those and figure out how to, what is the metadata needed so that anybody can use it, that'll be, it's a proof point and a referenceable implementation about what a product looks like. Right?
And that is literally one of the things we were discussing as part of kind of our closing thoughts. So Teresa, great to have you articulate that. Is there anything you wanted to also talk about when it comes to like how you think about the business user and having them define value?
Well, and at the end of the day, that business user is the best to be able to describe that. None of us are HR, finance experts. We talked a lot about engineering, but like real engineers, beyond data and software engineers, right? So if your business is not like a Uber or a LinkedIn, and if your business is in a different sort of field, it is still becoming a digital and data-driven business. That's where everybody's pivoting towards. And so that's exciting because there will be investment needed to make your product a smart product or make your business data-driven. And so that's where we are going to get funding to even make some of these changes. It's not going to be a cost-driven model, but it'll be a value-driven model to make people be able to see the same thing.
And over to you, Juan, for your thoughts on centralization.
Yeah, so I want to, before I go there, just what Teresa says, we need to be able to understand and connect everything that we're doing to the business value, right? I think we need to be able to go find the balance between centralization and decentralization. This really depends on the industry, on the company size, on the culture. There's no one size fits all around this stuff. And I think when you start balancing the centralization, decentralization, you are pushing kind of the work down to the domains that actually understand the data, and they're incentivized to go deal with it. And I want to share with folks kind of this framework that I'm thinking about. I call it the ABCs of data products. So if you push the data products to a domain, think about accountability. Who is responsible for this? Who fixes it when it breaks? Boundaries. What is this data product? What isn't it? Contracts and expectations. What are you expecting around this? What are the SLAs? How do you want to access the data? What do you expect the quality to go be for this particular data product? Downstream consumers. Who's going to be the user of this? Who are the next possible users? And explicit knowledge. What does this actually mean? What is the schema well defined? How is this data product can be used with other data products or should not be doing? And at the end of the day, this is all connected. It's all metadata needs to be connected. And that's why you say your metadata, it should be a metadata knowledge graph. So that's the point I want to drive here, close with.
Cool. Joe?
I think in closing, the thing I would amplify the most is Teresa's point, which I think I was making early on, which is that this is an iterative process and that you want to start with things you can fix, identify them. And so go through that workflow of like, what's a policy around this little thing? How can I make it visible? And then how can I get the incentives in place that we improve this stuff that we can see? And then iterating on that. And if you just start with like tracking identity, you're already well on your way to actually some of the issues around GDPR and stuff, right? So starting with very narrow things and iterating is the only way you're going to engineer your way through this stuff. And of course, you want tools and techniques along the way that'll help you with that. And so that would be my general things. It's all very big and overwhelming, and you got to start somewhere.
You can't improve what you cannot measure. Absolutely. Over to you, Amol, for your thoughts.
Yeah, first I want to say that I might have come across somewhat negative in some of my comments, but I'm actually a big optimist in terms of trying to figure out ways to solve this. Right? I think there's a ton of things for us to do as data governance people. I think there's as databases people, and just a huge number of problems. Right? I think some of the my things is more about cautioning. I think it kind of plays off what Joe just said, right? Like figure out what you can chip away at and learn from what's been done in the past. Right? In data integration world, for 25 years, we have struggled with solving even simplest of semantic problems. Right? In the semantic web world, the optimism was there from the beginning. Right? Let's define everything as services. Let's describe it, and then you can interpret. It hasn't really worked out that well, and I think making sure that we learn from those, making sure we understand that what we're doing is actually solvable. I think that's the key takeaway from my perspective here.
Great. Over to Josh.
Sure. Well, plus one to what Juan said about approaching data governance from a knowledge graph point of view. Not only because I'm a fan of knowledge graphs, but I think they're very appropriate to this domain. But yeah, I guess the main closing thought for me is that there's a lot of duplicate work being done in this area. By big companies like LinkedIn and Uber and Google and so on. But also, I imagine, by smaller companies as well. So, to the extent that we can compare notes like we're doing here, that's a good thing. Standards are good, but also just sharing best practices, sharing our solutions with one another, bouncing ideas off one another are all good things.
Great. And I think, Josh, you also had some ideas around other kinds of things beyond catalogs that we could standardize on in the area of policy languages and things like that. Would you care to elaborate a little bit there?
Well, yeah, that's where I'm a little bit cautious because the requirements of different companies around policies are so different. So that's where I say, having best practices that we can share, I think is important with respect to policies. Yeah, the specific policies are going to be very, much tied to, specific privacy policies of different companies, regulations that apply to one company and not another. But again, to the extent that we can share the overall approach that we're taking to, say, modeling policies, creating policy catalogs, linking, semantic terms to policy catalogs. All of that is, valuable things that we can be sharing with one another, and will produce work and make things better for everyone. I don't think there needs to be a lot of competition in this space. There's not a lot of secret sauce that needs to be guarded by our respective companies.
Cool. And on the topic of sharing, would like Nishant to share some of his thoughts around real life examples?
Yeah, so I'm going to use an example that Josh and I worked on when he was at Uber. Unfortunately, we got it going after he left. So Josh, this was an example of you planting the seeds and me getting the shade. So the example is when we were pushing the company to move towards categorization of data on the shift left spectrum, we said that not only are we adding some privacy related metadata to it, but we are actually creating a schema where none existed. You don't know, for example, 3 levels deep in this JSON blob, you could have an IP address that was collected from somebody's device pre-consent. You don't know that because there is no way to find that data. So we will create schema versions of this data, and then you can decide whether the unstructured data makes sense for you, or you need to have the schema that we have built. If you take our schema, you'll at least at a minimum know what these fields represent. So that automation means we get validation from engineers, and we can then right at that point correlate the data to future policies downstream, and we can do it at scale because the AI model keeps learning, as do the manual approvers of this schema process. So the example here is that as much as you automate things for privacy, compliance, or governance, there is a business benefit as well. This dichotomy where you have to make room for privacy or security or governance so that you don't, as a result, you don't get to do your day job as much as a false choice. You have to make the case that getting governance right and getting the automation done at scale and getting more accurate over time is a business benefit. And we have seen anecdotally that the quality of data has improved as a result. More data has gotten deleted, which means less cost to encrypt and store that data. And we've also seen the number of times queries were timing out because the data size was just too darn big has gone down as well. And as a result, more people are contributing to the automation because they see the benefit downstream. So I understand it seems very daunting in the beginning, but find somebody in the company that will do this for you, even on a case-by-case basis, and the positive value will keep adding up. And at some point, you won't even need to sell the argument anymore. Other people will do it for you.
Thanks for that. And I think, for the practitioners who are looking, what can we take away from it, despite all of the higher level concerns, right? You have to bring the business users along. You have to include incentives in your processes to make sure that people are actually brought in for the ride. From an engineering perspective, and from a how do we navigate the complexity of multiple different tools and multiple different concerns, we feel like a reference architecture is definitely emerging for a control plane that can enable some of this capabilities. So a couple of examples that we've already gone through is, examples of shifting left. You've got, and this is pulled from Data Hub, but the idea is just you've got a schema. You can annotate the, in this case, it's a protobuf schema, but pick your favorite schema definition language. You can add in the business terms, the business context, the classification terms right at check-in time. And those then automatically, as your CI/CD system builds the artifacts and pushes it to production, emits metadata that gets integrated into the metadata layer instantly. So it's not like someone's going in and trawling through logs and figuring out what happened, but it's actually part of your software development stack. Descriptions, context, as well as PII tags or team tags, all of this can be done. And some actual code exists now. So you could actually do things like this. And a lot of companies are actually starting to move in this direction. But taking a step further back, if you look at a lot of concepts that we talked about, and if you had to take it back as a single picture of how do I think about the modern stack, you've got all your systems up to the left, your Snowflakes and Sparks and Airflows and Looker and BigQuery and Great Expectations and all of these different systems that are continuously producing metadata. And so we talked about metadata exhaust. We hopefully think of it as metadata, structured metadata events, and not just cruft we're having to understand. Clean metadata coming out of these systems, being integrated into like a technical and operational metadata graph. These are the lower level concepts that engineers understand day in and day out. And on top of that is layered the business metadata graph. It includes, concepts like KPIs, glossaries, ownership, purpose, all of those higher order things that are so hard to get right, but need to get linked up with the lower level technical graph so that you can go both at the business level or at the technical level and always peel back the curtain and see on the other side what exists. And then sitting on top of this is your definition of good, right? Defining your policies almost as metadata tests, which are defined either on the business graph or on the technical graph or on the combination. You can have a policy that says, the operational characteristics of this thing has to be good. Landing times have to be 7 a.m. or before. And you can also add governance characteristics like the ownership of this needs to include at least one stakeholder and need to include at least one business user and things like that. And then you need to turn these tests into actions, right? So you have to have a system that can continuously evaluate these predicates against the continuously changing nature of your underlying graph. And then you go to your platforms and say, now I'm going to drive good and I'm going to make good happen. So you can say things like, we talked about things like setting retention policies, setting data access policies, being able to push a data health score into a Looker dashboard, being able to break a pipeline just before it was about to run and create bad data. All of these things can actually start to get enabled if we start snapping towards this kind of a reference architecture. The exact technology used for each of these, I don't care. I would prefer it be Data Hub, but I don't care. But really what is more important is that we all agree that this is a way where we can allow tools and technologies to thrive while still having this ability to centrally say, what does good look like, monitor it, and then being able to actually enforce it. So this is at least the way I like to kind of capture in a picture a lot of our thoughts and a lot of what we discussed as practitioners, as thought leaders. And we have a few minutes left. I know that we've had a lot of chatter going, and hopefully we've been able to address all of it. And we can take a few minutes to just see if there are additional questions that we would like to answer. And then we'll close it out and see you all on the internets.